happens in the medieval period in terms of the development of the church. And so, even though we're not covering quite so many years, I struggled with trying to get stuff into this lesson and not go too deep. We're looking essentially at 5 different topics that develop, and as you see from the timeline behind me, as we develop these topics, they're happening more or less simultaneously, or at least interwoven. And so even though I'm going to discuss them topically, understand that they didn't happen one after another, but they were sort of all happening in and amongst themselves. And the first is the development of the religious orders. Let me get to the correct slide here. The development of the religious orders. Now, this was something that came along pretty early on in the development of the church as it begins to diversify into these ideas that simply don't exist in Scripture. We had talked about, for example, the distinction that began to be made between presbyters and bishops, which is a distinction that the Scriptures don't make. Paul uses the 2 words interchangeably in Titus chapter 1 to speak of the same group of people. We saw that there was a development of these bishops who were over other bishops. They weren't called archbishops at that point yet. They were called metropolitans, but they soon came to be called archbishops. And then there ended up being a group that were over the archbishops called the cardinals, and then eventually the pope. We talked about the development of the 5 popes, and then the split between the church in the east and the church in the west, which effectively placed the Pope of Rome at the head of the church in the west. And we've seen that. But along with this idea of a distinction between what they called the clergy and the laity, that is, those who were ministers and those who were just ordinary church members, which is, again, something that Scriptures know nothing about. You begin to see the development of these orders within the church, these societies within the church of people that are practicing Christianity. This is the way they would put it, practicing Christianity in a way that was more special. Okay? And you had 4 types that developed, and we'll talk about the development in order in just a moment, but the 4 main types that you had were what were called canons regular, monastics, mendicants, and clerics regular. All 4 of these are distinguished from ordinary church members by a series of vows that they take. Number 1, they take a vow of chastity. Remember that celibacy is a big deal in the Catholic Church. That was, in fact, one of the issues that the Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't agree on. The Catholics said the priests must be celibate. The Eastern Church said, no, they don't have to be celibate. So a vow of chastity. Poverty, a vow of poverty. Understand that when they took a vow of poverty, they didn't necessarily conceive of poverty the same way that you and I conceive of poverty. When we think of poverty, we think about being poor. When they think about poverty, they think about more the inability to acquire what you might call generational wealth. In other words, you can acquire as much wealth as you wanted to during your lifetime. And in fact, some of the bishops and archbishops and all were fabulously wealthy, as we would look at it. The only thing is, as long as you're under a vow of poverty, when you die, you can't will that wealth to someone else. That wealth stays with the church or reverts back to the church. Okay? So you might be fabulously wealthy during your lifetime. You might enjoy every possible amenity and comfort that life has to offer, but you've taken a vow of poverty, so even though you live like a king, you just can't leave it to your son. Unless your son happens to get appointed to, take over your position, which, as we're going to see in a minute, happened more often than you might imagine. But a vow of poverty, and then a vow of obedience. Obedience here probably has more to do with obedience to the canon law of the church than necessarily obedience to the Scriptures, because they would say everyone is bound to be obedient to the Scriptures. Now let's talk about these 4 orders very quickly. Canons regular are clerics who recite the liturgy of the hours. There are, throughout the day, certain ceremonies that would be practiced at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, and some traditions later on in the evening as well. These clerics who recite the liturgy of the hours, who preside at those ceremonies, those would be what are called canons regular. That could be deacons, that could be priests, that could be bishops, anybody that does those sorts of things. Okay. Then you have monastics. Monastics are monks or nuns who went off to live in a monastery, and they also can recite the liturgy of the hours. In other words, they can preside at the liturgy of the hours. Some of the monastics didn't actually live in monasteries with other monks or nuns. Some of them are what we call hermits, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But the idea is that these are ascetics. These are people who commit themselves to a life of deprivation and are separated from the general flow of society. They live in a cloistered atmosphere with other people like them and no one else, or alone. Okay. Then we have what are called mendicants. Mendicants are people who are identified, the males as friars, the females as sisters. Friars and monks are not the same thing. Sisters and nuns are not the same thing, even though nuns refer to each other as sister. Slightly confusing there. These are people who were active not only in the liturgy of the hours, but they also evangelized through apostolic activities. Usually what that means is they were heavily involved in charity work. Okay? Very heavily involved in benevolence of different types. Franciscan monks are often, or friars are often mendicants. And they're very well known for their charitable work, that sort of thing. Okay, and then you have clerics regular. Clerics regular are those who are especially concerned with preaching. The Jesuits, for example, are an order of clerics regular. All right, so you have these orders that spring up. There is one other order that really no longer exists, but did very prominently during the time period we're talking about, and those would be what are called the military orders. Talk about those in a moment. So in the top left-hand corner of the screen here, you'll see what is a picture that's to represent the idea of a hermit. In the 200s and 300s, there were some groups of Christians in Egypt who wanted to follow the examples of Elijah and John the Baptist and go off in the desert and be hermits. And so that's what they did. They went off in the desert. They separated themselves from other people. They lived an ascetic lifestyle. And there were those who saw them, most notably Benedict, who came back to Rome with this idea of having encountered these hermits and said, hey, this idea of separating yourself and becoming holy, that's a good idea. We need to encourage that. And not only did he do that, but along about the same time, Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop in the northern part of Africa, also thought this was a good idea, and both of them wrote what were called orders. In other words, this was a written schematic plan for how to live your life as a hermit or as a monastic, as someone who separated themselves from society. And so the Benedictine order and the Augustinian orders are still in use today among your monastic orders. Okay? But they weren't the only ones. As we get into the period of time where the Muslims come into Europe, there was a need for military action in Europe, and so there arose these military orders. The ones almost everyone knows about are the Knights Templar. That was a military order. These were essentially warrior monks who had committed themselves to vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience with a special view towards doing physical warfare to defend the church. Okay? Another order would be the Knights Hospitallers. They still exist. They were not disbanded in the, 1300s that the Templars were disbanded. And then you have these mendicant orders that began to spring up. Francis of Assisi was the first to really get the mendicant orders to spring up. And basically his idea was, it's all well and good that you have these monks and nuns that are cloistered away over here being holy, but I believe the Bible says that our job is to go and minister to one another. And so their ministry was to minister to others, but they take this vow of poverty And so they live off of alms while they go and do charitable work for others. And then you had, not Xavier, names escape me. His last name's Loyola. If anybody knows his first name, please tell me, because it's flown right out of my mind. Ignatius Loyola, thank you, who founded the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order,
they were the Pope's hitmen.
yes, that's exactly right. They were a very militant preaching order, but you're exactly right. They were the Pope's hitmen. And as a matter of fact, right now tonight, there is a Pope on the throne in Rome who is the first ever Jesuit Pope. And part of the reason he's the first ever is because through the ages they have been recognized as being somewhat radical. And if you've paid very much attention to what this Pope has been doing, but even by Catholic standards, his behavior has been quite radical as popes go. And so yeah, they were the Pope's hitmen. That's a very good way to put it. But they were considered a preaching order, a clerical order. All right. So while all of this is developing, you also have the university developing. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is not because we're simply studying the history of Europe. We're not. The church became very heavily involved in education. Now, whoever controls education within 1 or 2 generations controls society, right? Because they are effectively indoctrinating the children who will grow up to believe more or less what they were taught as children. And if they can do that to 2 successive generations, they pretty much got society. Well, the church was not lax in losing the opportunity to educate the children. And so very early on, 300s, 400s, 500s, you begin to have what were called cathedral schools. And originally these cathedral schools were teaching an Aristotelian curriculum. In other words, it was the general ideas of education that Aristotle had advocated back in the Greek days. There was the trivium and the quadrivium, which were 3 and then 4 fields of study. The 3 were grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And then the 4, was arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. That was kind of your basic liberal arts education. And after 6 years of study in the trivium and the quadrivium, you could receive what was called the master's degree. Once you had that master's degree, you could then, if you wanted to, progress to study for a doctorate in one of 3 fields: law, medicine, or theology. And the prominence or the prestige was pretty much in that order. Law being the lowest, still is. Medical being the next, theology being the highest. And it might take quite a few years to be awarded the doctorate degree. But once you were awarded that degree, you could teach, you could practice pretty much anywhere. Now, these degrees came to be sanctioned by the church. Sort of in the same way that we look at it today as to whether or not you've been to, a school that's accredited. Most of our universities and colleges work really hard to obtain and maintain accreditation, because that sort of says to the world a degree from this school meets certain standards of excellence. By the way, does anybody know there is a very, very prominent school in the United States that is not now and never has been accredited, and yet their degree is accepted pretty much worldwide? Anybody know which one I'm talking about? Harvard University is not now and never has been accredited by any accrediting body. But if you have a degree from Harvard, pretty much nobody's going to not give you the job, right? But at any rate, these schools were just teaching children initially. Along comes Gregory in the 11th century, and he does some reforming of the church, and he begins to emphasize this idea of canon law and studying the sacraments, saying that the clergy need to know more. In other words, one of the issues he had was that the clergy across the church were too ignorant of the canon law of the church. Canon law had grown to be quite a body of law. Now think about this for just a moment. The United States has existed how long? Almost 250 years. What do the laws of the United States look like? It's a massive set of volumes, isn't it? And then you consider that every state has its own massive set of state laws. And then within that, each county has its ordinances and each city has its ordinances. The laws of the United States in only 250 years, slightly less, are massive. The church had also compiled massive, massive laws as they had met and had these various different synods and councils through the years and passed these canons, and popes had written these papal bulls and all of these sorts of things that amounted to canon law, and they wanted the priests to study them. And so the priests or the clerics or the clerical students began to hire teachers or get together teachers or get the church to hire teachers so that they could have these schools. And what had begun just as a school of general education began especially to be a specialized university for the clerics. And so most of the major universities that have been around a long, long time, think about the University of Bologna, the University of Naples, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of Paris, those all began in this way. And they all began with sanction from the Catholic Church. Okay? So now you have the Catholic Church that has these orders that are scattered all throughout Christendom, that are dedicated to the various works of the church. You have them in control of the education system, because frankly anybody who tried to educate children or students without the sanction of the church were at least suspected of heresy. Okay? And then you get into this question of investiture. In practice over the years, the church had not taken a heavy top-down approach to appointing the bishops and priests on the local level. They had more or less left that to the local nobles. And in a feudal society like you had in medieval Europe, in many times the local church was something that had been donated by and built by the local noble. A baron or a duke or whoever owned the land would donate the land for the church and the funds to build the church. And then it wasn't too long before they, because they were more or less the patron of the church, had a big say in who got appointed the bishop. Well, think about how medieval society worked. If you're a duke, if you're a baron, if you are a lord, who is going to take over after you die? Well, the law of primogeniture said your oldest male heir, right? Well, what if you had 2 sons, or 3 or 4? What are you going to do with those younger ones? You don't want to leave them out in the cold. And one way that you can ensure, number one, that they have a great deal of prestige, and in many cases also have a great deal of temporal wealth, even though it's not theirs to will to anybody else, they can enjoy it to their heart's content during their lifetime, would be to make sure that one of your younger sons was appointed a bishop. And so that began to happen. What if you don't have a son? Well, don't think that these conniving nobles didn't think of that possibility, because some of them didn't have a son or a younger son. And so the practice of selling the office to the highest bidder, behind closed doors, also happened. That practice was known as simony. Anybody know where simony comes from, the name of simony?
Simon tried to buy it.
That's right. Simon in Acts chapter 8, remember, who wanted to buy the power of the Holy Spirit from the apostles? It's the idea of buying that which is sacred. And so the practice of simony, selling these offices in the church, sprung up. And then, of course, nepotism had sprung up, appointing your own kids or kinfolks and that sort of thing. Well, when Pope Gregory VII becomes the Pope and he begins to do these Gregorian reforms, one of the things that he took on was the question of who actually appoints the bishops. Do the local nobles do it, or is this something that the church should be doing top down? Well, what that also entailed was this. If the nobles can appoint the bishops, guess where the archbishops come from? Well, they're elected by their fellow bishops. And guess where the cardinals come from? Well, they're elected by the archbishops. And guess where the Pope comes from? Well, he's elected by the cardinals. And if the nobles control the bishops, archbishops, and cardinals because they appointed them and they're beholden to them, they control by proxy who becomes pope. And that's exactly what was happening. There was all kinds of political wrangling going on. All kinds of alliances being formed and broken and reformed among nobles to try and control this group and that group of the bishops of the church to make sure they got the pope they wanted. Well, Gregory put his foot down and said, oh, no, you don't understand. See, the nobles don't get to control the church controls the church. And in fact, what it really was a power struggle between the church on the one hand and the nobles on the other hand. Well, Gregory and Henry IV of Germany, who would later become Henry the Holy Roman Emperor, got into it over this, and Gregory excommunicated Henry. So Henry turns around and appoints his own pope. Well, they sort of made friends, and then they got into it again, and Gregory excommunicated him again. 3 times Gregory excommunicated Henry. Every time he did that, Henry went and appointed his own pope. Finally, they call a council. And in this council, they determine that the church is the one that gets to appoint the bishops. But in order to placate the nobles, the bishop has to swear fealty to the local nobles. And that way they can't be untrue to the local nobles' interest when they go up to Rome and cast their votes and that sort of thing, but they really owe their power to the church. Now, this was the first council of the Lateran in 1123 that determines this, and what it essentially was a coup for the church in saying that the church now controls the power structure within itself. The nobles do not. Okay? Now, all the while all this stuff is going on, you have Muslims that have come on the scene. Remember that it was in the late 500s and early 600s that Muhammad lived. He died in 632. We don't know exactly when he was born, sometime around 570. And he begins to put together this doctrine of Islam, and they very quickly, within his lifetime, take over the Arabian Peninsula. They were very, very militant with their beliefs. Within 120 years of the death of Muhammad, they had not only taken over all of the northern coast of Africa, everything from the Sahara north to the Mediterranean Sea. They had taken over the Middle East, which included modern-day Iraq, but more importantly, modern-day Iran, which was then known as what? Anybody know? Persia until the 1970s, right? They took over Persia. They even invaded as far east as India and as far north as the Caspian Sea, and they were moving west on the northern side of the Mediterranean Sea into Asia Minor. Well, at the northwestern corner of Asia Minor is Constantinople, right? That's the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and it's also the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Well, in order to get there, one of the places they take very early on is what was considered the Holy Land, Palestine, where all your Bible stories happen, where Jerusalem is located. And just north of Palestine, Antioch, the first Gentile church, and one of the very important places for the early church. And as they spread into Egypt, they take over Alexandria. Well, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria are 3 of the principal sees of the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? But they are also places that are still considered holy by the Roman Catholic Church. And so you have these Muslims who are taking over these holy places, and this is going to lead to the Crusades. But before we get there, I want you to notice that they didn't only take over northern Africa. When they get to the western coast of Africa, they turn north and across the Straits of Gibraltar entered into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And they took over Spain and Portugal as far north as the Pyrenees Mountains. The Pyrenees Mountains kind of cut off the rest of the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe, and so that formed a nice natural boundary. But the Muslims, who were called at that time either Saracens or Moors, when you read about them in history, you'll read those 2 names, were in charge in that part of Europe, in Spain and Portugal, until the 1400s. Okay? And so you have what is seen as a crisis of these Muslims taking over, and the response of the church was to begin to mount these crusades. And the idea initially was to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels. That's how it would have been put. 1095, Pope Urban II calls for a crusade to go and aid the Byzantine Empire to fight off these Saracens, these Turks, and liberate the Holy Land. They were fairly successful. They set up the states of the Holy Land that are shown on this map. The county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The problem was it just took a few years until the Muslims took them back over. In other words, when the majority of the army went back home to Europe, the Muslims moved back in and took them back over. And so they'd mount another crusade. If you notice on the timeline up here, if you can read my chicken scratch, from 1095 all the way to 1265, almost 200 years, you have a series of 8 church-sanctioned crusades and several more minor crusades sprinkled throughout there that were not necessarily officially sanctioned, going over into Palestine. Now, that's all well and good. First Crusade liberates a lot of Palestine. The Second Crusade is not quite as successful. In fact, it's basically a failure. The Third Crusade is probably the one that forms a large part of your conception of medieval chivalry, crusading, and all that sort of thing, because the Third Crusade was led by Richard I, the Lionheart of England. And he leads this crusade, and he is fighting against this Muslim general named Saladin. You've probably heard of this. And there's this epic war between Richard and Saladin, whereby Richard eventually re-liberates most of the Holy Land, goes back to England. He's a hero of the church. He's a hero of England, and he's considered very highly. Well, guess what happens when Richard goes back to England? The Muslims move back in and take back over. And so a Fourth Crusade is mounted. The Fourth Crusade gets essentially to the coast of Palestine, sees that they can't do much, and by the way, just like there's political wrangling going on all over Europe, there's political wrangling going on by the leaders of these crusades, whereby they're trying to negotiate these settlements that may or may not be popular back home. They're hoping they're popular back home. They're hoping that these settlements not only get the church what they want, but if they can possibly play it in such a way that whoever their political rivals are come out on the short end of the stick, and they come out with more popularity or more sanction from the church or more whatever, then they're doing that as well. Well, the fourth crusade is an utter failure, and so they start back home, and along the way they just decide to stop and sack the city of Constantinople. Well, now wait a minute, Constantinople is not held by Muslims. It is almost entirely populated with Eastern Orthodox people. Fellow Christians, if you will, just on the other side of the East-West split. They sack the city of Constantinople, destroy it, raze it to the ground in large part, you gotta be kidding me, and create, if there was a divide between East and West, they just solidified it, okay? Remember that the Great Schism happens in 1054. The Third Crusade is right here in 1188, just a little over 100 years after that. That really puts the death knell in any idea of rejoining these two. All right, quickly. The Inquisitions. Long about the time this is going on, you have these Inquisitions. A great many of them were, they were not official. In other words, it was just locals who thought somebody was doing wrong, and so they used whatever methods they needed to convict them, oftentimes torture and things of that nature. Beginning in 1184, the church tries to sort of formalize the Inquisitions, and the modern scholarship says that probably what the church was trying to do is the opposite of what most people perceive the Inquisitions to be. Most people perceive the Inquisitions being a barbaric opportunity for the church to attack its enemies and torture them into recanting or burning them at the stake. Actually, it seems like what the church was trying to do was regulate those people who were already doing that. And limit the amount of torture that they could do, limit who they could kill and under what circumstances, make them give them a trial, make them be some standards for the trial, things of that nature. But you have three levels of inquisitions. First are the episcopal inquisitions that were sanctioned in 1184. Then the legatine inquisitions. These were legates of the Pope that go out and hold the inquisitions. And then finally, under Gregory IX, you have what are called the papal inquisitions. He's trying to further regularize this. Well, along about this same time, you have this ongoing war between England and France. And in this war, you have a young lady named Joan of Arc who rallies the French troops to a great defeat of the English. However, the English captured Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc was wearing armor because she was on the battlefield. And so they accuse her of heresy, her main heresy being wearing men's clothes. And they lock her up in the tower. Well, she won't take off her armor. You know why she won't take off her armor? Because every time she does, the English captors try to rape her. So she puts her armor back on. Well, they said, well, she's just a recalcitrant heretic. She just keeps going back to her heresy, so they burn her at the stake after calling in the Inquisition to rubber stamp it. Her mother petitions the Pope to have a new Inquisition impaneled to retry the issue of her guilt, and they do impanel a new Inquisition at Notre Dame in Paris. They retry her guilt and decide that she was innocent. Too late, she's already been burned at the stake. So they canonize her and make her a saint instead. All right? The popes of Avignon. Let me get this real quick. There was a feud between Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII. You know what the feud was over? Philip IV wanted the church to finance his war with England. Boniface said, oh no, your war, your money. You're not taking church money to go fight with England. They were always fighting between England and France. Well, Philip IV essentially starts a feud. Boniface dies. Actually, Boniface was beaten to death by some allies of Philip IV. His successor pardons Philip IV and then dies himself within a year. And his successor is Clement V, who's a Frenchman and an ally of Philip IV. He moves the seat of the papacy to Avignon, France. And the papacy remains in Avignon, at least officially, until 1417. Now, in 1376, Gregory the 11th inexplicably returns to Rome. Now, he was a Frenchman, but I think he realized that the seat of the papacy didn't need to be under the thumb of the French king, and so he goes back to Rome. He dies almost as soon as he gets there. They elect, the cardinals do, they elect Urban VI, who's an Italian, to replace him, and the Frenchmen don't like it, so they convene a new conclave, and they elect Clement VII, who's French. Guess what Clement VII does? He sets up office back at Avignon. Now you've got competing popes. And you've got competing popes from 1378 all the way until 1417 when they hold another conference, another council, and they decide that the conclave of 1378 that appointed Clement VII, invalid, you can't do that. But they also dethrone the competing Roman pope, and they appoint someone that they can all agree on, whose name is Martin V, and everybody's happy, and we're back to having a pope in Rome. The point I want you to see is this. The church controls the military. The church controls the nobles. The church controls the schools. The church is effectively in control of the money, and the church is in control of the courts. Step by step by step, the Roman Catholic Church was taking control of every facet of society. That is going to be a big motivator for what we're going to look at next week, Lord willing, which is the beginning of the Reformation movement. That, along with all of this corruption and political infighting that we've been seeing now for for over 1,000 years. All right, thank you so much for your attention.
That was the fastest explanation of Joan of Arc I've ever heard.